Okay, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for registering and being here to listen in on our conversation today on decolonizing project management with my good friend and colleague, Noelle Saemerow. Noelle and I have been working together now for a couple of years, and I feel so fortunate and honored to get to work alongside Noelle, but also learn from Noelle as well. In working together, Noelle has created a very powerful conversation on decolonizing project management that she's offered to a couple of teams. And I came knocking on Noelle's door asking if she would host a webinar conversation to help bring this very important work to many organizations across the country, given the work that we do in reconciliation, cultural safety, and decolonizing the work that we do in the era of truth and reconciliation. So thank you so much for being here. Noelle has agreed to answer any and all questions that you have off the top of your heart and your mind. So we're aiming for around 45 minutes worth of content, followed by 15 or 20 minutes worth of conversation. Noelle welcomes questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. So feel free to use the Q&A function for questions as they come up for you, and I will help moderate those for Noelle when we get to the Q&A function. And just as a reminder, this webinar is being recorded and will be archived and made available through our website, our newsletter, and our social media channels later this evening, Pacific Standard Time. So without further ado, I'm going to hand the floor over to my good friend and colleague, Noelle. Thank you so much for being here. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Len, and thank you for that amazing opening. It is always a dream of mine to be welcomed and introduced by Len Pierre. So there we go. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining today over your lunch hour, or if we're in a different time at 3 p.m. I very much appreciate your time and your space. And so, yeah, like Len said, my name is Noelle Saemerow. I use pronouns she and her, and I am Métis on my mother's side from her father, and I'm mixed white settler on my dad's side. And so, like Len said, I've been with the team for a couple of years now, and it's been an amazing journey. I've learned so much from every organization I'm able to work with, and from all my team members and community members. And so what today is a little bit of sharing back that information that I have learned, things I've picked up along the way, maybe things that don't work as well. And I hope that we can learn together today. So I am sure that in the many different sectors that we cover in the room today, there are so many different experiences and teachings and learnings. And so I encourage you to share them in the Q&A with our fellow professionals in the chat and in the call so that we can learn from each other. And so, yeah, with that, I'd like to open with a territory acknowledgement, acknowledging that I, as a Métis woman, I'm an uninvited guest and settler on these territories, as I am not, my family is not from these lands. And so I am located on the stolen traditional ancestral territories of the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh nations. So this is a shared territory, what is now known as Vancouver. And I have the privilege to be able to live, work, benefit from the territory that has been stewarded by First Peoples since time out of mind. And so I encourage you during our session, but also right now and moving forward, to reflect on what land means to you, what the territory you're in means to the First Peoples. And feel free, I think we have a Q&A, not as much of a chat, but feel free to reflect on or just include where you're calling in from today or where you're situated. And so my intention of our next 55 minutes together is to share, like I said, some of these learnings that I've picked up. So I come to you with an open mind, an open heart, and I ask that I'm received in the same way. These are just the beginnings of my learnings. And so I fully expect that lots of people on this call will teach me just as much. And I am excited to learn together in this journey because the spaces that I've worked in, which is primarily Indigenous health, it has allowed me to explore what a decolonized practice might look like. And so, of course, it's evolving, it's changing, and we're sorting out what that is going to look like and how it can fit into our more professional colonial systems, but I think we can sort of stumble through the journey together. So what we'll be covering today is a little bit of our background of why we would like to decolonize our project management systems. So we're going to talk about colonialism, a little bit of decolonization. We're going to go into two-eyed seeing, and if we haven't heard of that, it is being able to see from both our Indigenous worldview and more of our Western worldviews, and so using those two eyes. And then we're going to use both of those sort of learnings and background to inform our tools, some of the suggestions, some of the practical learnings that I've picked up. And within those, I'd love to hear more examples or thoughts from your sector, from your spot of where you exist in the sort of professional world. So to get started, we'll talk a little bit about colonialism and decolonization. So colonialism, as we know, is ongoing. And so we don't use the word colonization because it implies that it is in the past. It is historical and therefore finished. And so the word colonialism implies and lets us know that it is ongoing. So the premise of our country, which is now known as Canada, was very much built on the idea that Indigenous peoples were less than. And so this is done in very many colonial spaces that we do so that we can move into these spaces and oppress those people and either take those resources or move into that land. And so these negative messages were the basis of the beginning of this country. And so when we built on those ideas at the beginning of this country, that was the foundational belief that built all of our systems, our academic system, our corporate systems, our justice, our healthcare, all of it was built on the idea that Indigenous people were less than. And so with these ideas so deeply ingrained, unfortunately, the way our systems around us were created was through this idea. And so these systems were not created to support or uplift Indigenous peoples within them. And so today, that is what we see, is this ongoing colonialism that is very much present in our systems. And so conversely, what is decolonization? So this is that process of disrupting the colonial structures that are around us and that are created around us. And so how that would look is, of course, going to take generations, but each of us can work on that process of disrupting, of sort of the status quo is going and we sort of throw a rock in it, we throw a ripple into the water, and it creates that little bit of dismantling of the system that is around us. And it takes all of us, and it will take many generations, but it is the idea that we create these systems and we're able to dismantle them so that they work better for Indigenous peoples as well as many equity-deserving communities. And so when we look at equity and equality in this country, I think sometimes we use those two words interchangeably. And so when we come back to the basis of it, equality is the same and equity is more fair. And so my favorite, this is like a very clear example, which would be if I gave every single person in this room a shoe that fit me. And so it would be the same, it would be like an 8.5, fairly standard. However, it wouldn't fit everyone in this room. There's a few of us that it might be too small, too big, and wouldn't work. And so I might say, well, that works for me. I don't understand why it doesn't work for you. And so equity would be acknowledging that all of us need very different things to succeed, and you will need shoes that fit you, or it will be very difficult to walk or run around. And so that at the very basis is how we can look at equity and how we can begin to understand it, and that it is not equality because it is not the same. And so in this country, like we talked about, equity deserving groups. So we know Indigenous peoples, but we also know there are many other groups in this country that are historically marginalized due to the systems created around them. And so this involves people in the 2S LGBTQIA+ community. This involves folks who are newcomers to this country, people of color, people who use substances, people with disabilities, women, as well, of course, as Indigenous people. And so what we know about equity deserving groups is that these are communities that are not facing challenges because of who they are. They're facing challenges because of the societal structures around them, not allowing them to succeed by just existing. And so we know that these systems work better for some people. And so equity-seeking groups are folks that experience these barriers and are then seeking to reduce them, reduce the disadvantage that they experience due to these systems. And so a very clear, in my eyes, example of inequality versus equality is this one here. This is an amazing example. And so on the top left, we see little boy on the left. He has lots of apples on his side. And so little boy on the right has next to no apples. And so when they come home at the end of the day, if their mom was to say, hey, why did little boy on the left get so many more apples? You must have been working a lot harder. But when we understand this, we understand that they don't have equal opportunity at all. And so then we try to fix it. We think, okay, well, little boy on the right can't get the apples because he doesn't have a ladder. And so we'll both give them the same ladder. We'll give them the same supplies, the same resources, the same supports to succeed. But then they come home and for some reason, boy on the left still has more apples. And so what we see here is that even by giving them the same resources, the same supports, and the same tools to succeed, boy on the left, because of the environment, is just able to succeed easier. He's able to get more apples. He's able to come home and say that, look how many apples I collected because I worked harder, or perhaps. And so little boy on the right is still not achieving. He's still not getting the apples on his side of the tree. And so when we compare that to equity, we acknowledge that little boy on the right actually needs a bigger ladder. He can't reach the apples on his side of the tree without it. And little boy on the left doesn't need a bigger ladder because he can reach the apples on his side. And so when we acknowledge that even though it feels strange, perhaps, to offer one person in this scenario more, it actually is fair. Because when we acknowledge this, that the system, the tree, is not made to support little boy on the right. There are not enough apples. And so he needs more supports to succeed. So that is things that we can offer. We can offer more supports, more tools, so that individuals can succeed in the environments that weren't created for them. However, what we're striving for is this decolonized system, which in other settings is also called justice. And so I love this example because we can see the tree is so fruitful. There are so many apples off of every space of this tree because we have fixed and upheld the system. We have sort of supported the tree so that it stands better, grows better, allows for fruit to be equally distributed. And so that represents our systems around us. And so if we are able to decolonize our systems so that they work better for all of our people operating in them, then we will see that change and we will see better outcomes. But unfortunately, we're not quite there yet. And so that is our ultimate goal that we're working towards. And we get there by chipping away at decolonizing our systems and also acknowledging that in the interim, equity has to be hardwired into the work that we do because we're not there yet. We have a hand raised. Just see it pop up on my screen.
Yeah, just 1 second. Let me see if I can ask Pete to unmute himself. Allow to talk. There you go, Pete. Do you have a question?
Oh, you're muted. Sorry, Pete. You're muted. All right, Pete, maybe you can pop it in the chat and I can come back to you.
Jocelyn also has her hand up. If I can, I'm just
Yeah.
going to allow her to talk. There you go, Jocelyn. Folks seem to be having a problem. I'm just going to ask you to unmute.
Maybe it's a technology.
Yeah. Oh, there we go.
I did it by accident.
Oh.
Sorry.
That's okay. Hello.
No
Hello. Thank you.
No problem.
I'm just going to put her back into the audience.
All right.
Pete, I'm going to give it one more try. Ask to unmute. There we go.
Oh, hi there. My name's not Pete. It's actually Rita Meze.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry, that's my husband's name. I should have changed that. Apologies. But no, I think this is really, really exciting initiative and a great way of sort of, visualizing what can be achieved. And you know, I'm just wondering in terms of you know, in terms of what are the low-hanging fruit, if you will, if I want to follow this analogy, in order to get to the, you know, the into the end point, to get us closer to the end point, to the decolonization picture.
Well, what I would say is it's so many little things, and it will take generations, most likely. And so what we can do is chip away at these little things. And so for this presentation, for project management, what we'll talk about is a little bit of the ways that we can kind of disrupt the system so that hopefully we start to be able to shift it to get it towards decolonized, but it will require constant education and sort of relooking at ourselves and reflecting on the ways that we show up. So it'll be very much so ongoing, I would say. Thank you for your question. All right. So throughout this presentation, using what we just sort of talked about, I'd like us to reflect on these two questions. So if you have a piece of paper, feel free to write them down or take a little picture. But our first one is, what opportunities do we have in the work that we do with our power to provide equity where we have once provided equality? And so let's sort of think about these opportunities that are in our sphere of influence. And then when we think about those opportunities, our brain goes, well, I can't do that because of this. So let's also write down the fears, the challenges, and the roadblocks that come up to uplifting equity deserving groups. So this is any barrier, funding, anything else that you might feel comes up when those opportunities are also coming up. So the negatives that bring us back. And so when we can consider throughout this ways that we can dismantle these challenges together. So we're going to talk a little bit about two-eyed seeing, and I mentioned a little bit before about what it is, but it really is from Dr. Albert Marshall, an elder, describes it as learning to see from one eye the strengths of Indigenous knowledges and ways of knowing, and then our other eye is these mainstream or Western ways of knowing and knowledge. And so what we acknowledge as Indigenous peoples, as people in this country, that we are together. We are in it together. And so being able to see using both of our eyes and understanding the ways that we can use both knowledge and both ways of being to best support us and best support our processes is amazing. And so figuring out ways to include both will take time, of course, because we've never really had to integrate that before. And so the ways that this can sort of look is looking at this sort of Venn diagram of Indigenous values and the corporate, more Western values of what we see in a common workplace, or what I have seen, I will say. And so what we see a lot is the value on academia and science. I have a bachelor's of science from Simon Fraser University, but I find that the things that I learn in community and the relationships I build are so important to the work that I do, less so the work I did in a lab. And that does, you know, directly relate to the work that I do, but those are the things that I have found to be seen as very important when it's less what I use in my job. And so we see a lot of hierarchical structures when we look at org charts, right? We know who's above us and who is below us. And we also really are focused on restricting our emotions. And so for me, I'm a very emotional lady, and I show up in the workplace as that. And I'm very much so clear with my colleagues, with my supervisors, that when I show up in the workplace, I show up as myself and I show up with my emotions. And so whether that's the Indigenous values in me or the inability to hide my emotions, we will say, we don't know. But it really is important to me that when I show up in a space that I can bring all of me. And how I am in a day, whether I am feeling a bit more down or a bit more tired, that the people around me respect that and know me enough that we can all support each other in this space. And so that has really allowed me to thrive in my workplace by being able to be open with the people around me and the people who can support me, especially when I'm not doing so great. And so what we see in the overlap of these two ideologies is two-eyed seeing. It is the focus on cultural safety, which we've already seen in so many sectors, right? We see trauma-informed practice, which we've been working on for quite a while. We look at humility and equity, reconciliation. And so all of this is using both of our eyes to see. And so really, at the end of the day, it is that equity that is going to get us into two-eyed seeing. My other sort of favorite learning of cultural safety has been learning about time. And so we learn about sort of these two separate ways of viewing time. And when I heard these, my mind was sort of blown. And so we have Kairos time and Chronos time. And so I grew up, and I think many of us did, with the knowledge of Chronos time. A minute is a minute. We measure time in 60 seconds is a minute, and we measure time in hours, and we have past, present, and future. And we move along as that goes. But then there's this other way of looking at time called Kairos time, which is also known as a higher time. And so the way I describe this is that we measure time in moments, not in minutes. And so a moment takes as many minutes as it takes, right? Until that moment is finished and done completely. And I will say, you know, when you start an agenda and we say, okay, we're gonna have an elder welcoming and we'll put that down for 3 to 7 minutes. Okay, so that's actually not gonna work because we understand that the moment takes as long as it needs to take. And so that is something that we can kind of work into our project management skills in our toolbox. And I'll touch on that in the next couple slides, but being able to be flexible. It is very difficult to feel flexible in an environment that is so structured, but that deep breath and going, this is a moment, and the moment will take the time that it needs to take. And so now we get into the tools. This is my more nitty gritty. So this is an amazing quote that I think can start any way that we look at something that might feel uncomfortable or new or scary or we've never done before. We can't solve the problems by using the same thinking that we used when we created them. And so the problem in this scenario is these colonial structures that are built with the idea that Indigenous people are less than. And so in order to dismantle this structure, we need to use a different sort of thinking. So my different sort of thinking involving project management is, how do I decolonize this? How do I use two-eyed seeing to look at project management and project coordination and incorporate that? And so these questions I'd like us to reflect on while we go over some of these resources and learnings that I've picked up. And so see if it can fit into your space, into your sector. So our first question is, how do our leadership and our project management frameworks shift once we start to implement equity? And so I know our project management brains will go, okay, well, timeline, details, framework, I'll come up with it right now. No, I don't need you to do that. What we're gonna do is focus on how would it shift emotionally? How would it shift spiritually for you? How will your workplace or your role feel different if we implemented some of these suggestions? And so you don't have to have it all figured out about how it's going to look or how it's going to play out, but how would it feel for you to have some of these in place? And so the second part of this is, how do we challenge the status quo? A lot of the times when we start to shift and start to use some of these practices, decolonizing our project management, we are already challenging the status quo. But something that we can remind ourselves is that privilege we carry. I hold immense privilege, even as an Indigenous person. I am white passing. I hold immense white privilege. I am able-bodied. I am cisgender. There's immense privileges I hold in the world, and acknowledging these privileges and how I can use them in benefit of those around us, equity-seeking individuals, is the important part. And so Len kind of says usually that there's another word for ally, which is accomplice, which I love. And sometimes, you know, we'll joke, well, it makes it sound like we're doing something bad or something illegal. But sometimes going against the status quo is breaking a rule. And the amount of times I have seen that while working in very large healthcare systems that have processes that are set up, and they're just not set up for our people, or they're just not set up in the best possible way. And so sometimes, I will not lie to you, I have broken the rules and only enough that I know that I'm still safe and I have a job and I can feed myself, right? These are decisions we make knowing the consequences, but it's also, what can I push and ask for forgiveness for after. And I'm not encouraging you to break all of the rules ever, but just the things where you know that it's not right, and maybe it's the way it's always been done. How do we advocate for these things that we know at the end of the day are right? And so how do we decolonize our work? I have a couple sort of main topic points, I guess. So we'll cover governance first. And for me, when it comes to governance, it is so crucial that we take the guidance and leadership and governance of the local land-based First Nations whenever possible. And so, like I acknowledged, I'm a Métis person, I'm Indigenous, but I'm not Indigenous to this territory. This is Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh territory. And so enacting a project that is on this territory will involve Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh, and has to, because this involves their territories and their peoples. And so we also acknowledge that, of course, there are many urban and away from home Indigenous people, Métis, Inuit, and First Nations people who are not land-based from this territory. And so that is where engagement as well comes in, ensuring that we see representation from all these different types of folks. And so I will also say, in terms of governance, ensuring that right from the beginning, this is thought of. It is much harder and a little bit more embarrassing when you go later. When you go to the community later and you say, hey, actually, we've been working on this for a couple of years and we just sort of want you to vet it now. That's a tick box, unfortunately. And so that is not where we want to strive for. We want to strive for, we're thinking about this, and where right on the ground floor, who can I include to make sure I have every perspective that I might need? And so that is the Indigenous people, preferably the land-based First Nations folks. And so again, like we see when engagement, FNMI, if we're unclear about that acronym, it is First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. We have to ensure that throughout this engagement, building and sustaining relationships is so important. So throughout this engagement, trust, accountability, ensuring that we are transparent with our work and what the intentions are and what we intend to do with the engagement we receive. As well as including youth and elder representation. Oftentimes we see a lot of engagement with sort of our folks around the middle age, adulthood, but we really need those opinions from our Indigenous youth and Indigenous elders, as the youth, of course, are our future, and the elders have seen and hold so much knowledge about their own communities and their families. And so I would also just ensure that, depending on your project, including chief and council, as well as family and community engagement, medicine people in the community, environmental specialists. Many nations have environmental specialists that focus on the conservation of their territories. And there's no one better to receive environmental advice from than First Nations people, lawyers, policymakers, anyone within community that could provide a perspective that perhaps is different than our own. And so another one that we can look at is agendas. And I mentioned that a little bit earlier, but my new favorite thing that I've been trialing is, instead of a really specific agenda where we send out the time you get to speak, how long you're allotted, and then what exactly will be covered, I've sort of started shifting to an order of events where the most important things that have to be covered go at the front. They go at the beginning of the meeting because you know you're going to get to them. And let's say that really important thing took the whole hour meeting. And that would be because that moment needed to happen for an hour. And so it might throw a wrench into some of our plans when we focus on planning, but that's when our flexibility has to come in, where we go, okay, so that clearly needed that longer moment. So now we have to sort of shift. And so I have found that to be working quite well, but it is something that you can try out. Let me know. I also obviously always ensure that there's time and space at the beginning, and I like end as well, of meetings to do an opening, a welcome, ensure that elders are specifically from the land-based nation that you were gathering on are welcoming you to the territory. Ensure there are land acknowledgements included, and those shouldn't be done by the land-based First Nation individual. That is the welcome and the opening. And yeah, really creating sort of a welcoming space that agendas don't feel so rigid and structured. I know that's the point of an agenda, but I think it's that starting to look at how do we create room for flexibility. as well as elders. And so when we bring elders in, of course, from our land-based First Nations, of course, providing them a gift and an honorarium or a payment, as well as any knowledge keepers or any engagement or community members as well. There should be budget line items in there for ensuring to pay folks for their time, their energy, and their life experience. That is huge and oftentimes sort of undervalued for how much elders offer to our communities, our peoples. And yeah, really any table can be provided benefit through an elder lens. And so when we look at reporting, this is also something, of course, that comes up a lot in project management. So I have administered grants myself and also managed contracts with some external agencies that required reporting. And so what I found was that some partner agencies might have trouble with standard implemented reporting styles. And that is very much okay, because oftentimes those are very strenuous and ridiculous. And so we made adjustments. We would find out what worked best for that specific partner. And sometimes that would be adjusting the style of reporting, so the questions, because we were able to do that. Sometimes it would be, I would have a phone call or a video call with the individual, and they would talk to me and tell me stories about the reporting and about their organization and about what they were accomplishing. And I would fill in the report and then send it back to them for review. There are lots of different ways that we can support our partners in reporting, acknowledging that many, if they're a smaller Indigenous organization in this example, they don't have the capacity to be reporting at the immense lengths that they're required to. And so it's figuring out ways about what will work with each person, or each organization, I guess. And so we also look at whether or not, I mean, in my opinion, one of the better ones right now is Vancouver Foundation, and they administer grants, and they've really been decolonizing their approach to the point of they say, you send us what you believe you need to report on. If that's nothing, then that's nothing. If that's no funding reporting, then that's no budget or funding reporting. And so to me, that showed that immense trust in the organization that is delivering the project or the grant. And so that is something that I try and consider when possible, is what can we relax on? What can we shift? What can we offer in alternatives? And then when we come to funding timelines, how are we practicing two-eyed seeing? How are we looking at, yes, what might have to be mandated due to a grant, due to our government, due to a timeline, but what also, on the other hand, can we be flexible with? Len's amazing quote, and I think many others, is we move at the speed of trust. And so that might not be quick, and that might not be in the timeline that was originally stated for the funding. And we're going to deep breath it out because it is stressful, and I know that. However, when we create a very clear outcome for our project, and we build this framework for our project collaboratively and with other folks from community, Indigenous peoples, our partners, then we understand and we're all aware transparently about what the project intends to do. And if things come up and along the way of the project, we're remaining accountable, then we can be flexible with what our successful outcome is. So we can balance what is realistic and being done at the speed of trust, and what has to be done for our project goals. Maybe throughout those project goals shift throughout the project because the timeline isn't making sense anymore, and that's okay. And so I would focus, because we don't always know what's going to happen, I would focus on the honesty, the transparency, and just remaining receptive to feedback. And so throughout this project, if we're able to pivot or refocus our attention, then it removes the idea that we've overpromised, or that we feel that we are speeding things up when they don't need to be sped up, or that we're not doing things in a good way just to get them done. And so my last sort of couple reminders in terms of very tangible ways to improve yourself as a project manager, as a lead for this project. I very much know that it is your job as a project manager not to manage people. It is to manage the project. However, I'm very firmly believing that it is your job to manage the relationships. It is your job to make sure that the relationships between partners, between team members are good, are positive, are strong, are truthful, honest. And so when, as the sort of lead, again, not to manage the people, but to understand that when the project is occurring, if you see something that's not going well, it is your job to put a stop to it or to draw boundaries. And so you'll start to see maybe relationships are not going in the way you see them going, or that they should be going. You put a stop to that, you draw the boundary on that and go, actually, we're going to do this in the best possible way by building the best possible relationships with partners and our team members. And by doing that, we call it when we see it not being done well. And that's our job. Your voice is very crucial because you lead, you push forward the project. And so if you're able to slow down the project, yes, you don't have to manage all the people on your team, but you do have the ability to slow down and speed up that project. And so that I find to be really, really important in your role as a project manager, because yes, we manage the project, but we manage the relationships at the base of that project. My other really helpful tip that I've been seeing a lot in different organizations is being able to cross-train our team members. And so what I used to see was we would fill these really specific roles. So someone would have an expertise in this and not know how to do anything else on their team. Other person would be an expert in this and know everything. And if they were to be gone or sick or off for a couple weeks due to mental health, that role suffers. And that individual has a really hard time taking time off because they know that the organization will suffer or the project will suffer without them. And so my whole thing is, yes, people hold their different strengths, of course, but we also can help support each other and fill in when necessary. And that creates a really nice teamwork amongst the group, acknowledging that we're able to support and uplift each other when we're not doing amazing or when things come up. And then my last one, which is I'd say the most important, is throughout this project and throughout managing your relationships, you model to your team, to your partners about how they're able to behave because you are the project manager, you set the speed. And so by taking care of your own mental health, by supporting yourself, you're able to monitor that really good behavior and encourage others as well to take care of themselves. What I've found is in teams where they really support me to take mental health days when I need them, those are the jobs in which I am able to thrive the most because I feel taken care of, I feel welcomed, but I also am able to keep myself healthy enough to keep doing the job. And so that is how we sort of not only support each other with our workload, but also with our mental well-being, which in turn helps our workload. And so we're going to talk a little bit about some trauma-informed communication strategies because, excuse me, when we want quality engagement, we really need to be able to form these meaningful relationships, and the relationships rely on trust and building that respectful space. So we can do that through the ways that we communicate. So here are just some sort of tips about when we show up in a space, how do we, oops, sorry, one too many. How do we show up in a way that creates or implies to create a space that is safe enough for people to share with us? Because a lot of the times we'll say, you know, we made this space and yeah, it's safe, but we are the ones, by creating the space, we can't determine it if it is a safe space. It's sort of like cultural safety, right? Cultural safety is determined by the people who receive our care. And so the space, whether it's safe or not, is determined by the people in our space. But we can do things to make them feel a little safer, which is that proximity, sort of seeing how close I am to someone, if we're in person, allowing space for people to bring things to you and not react immensely if they're negative, ensuring we have patience and, like I said, flexibility with people on their strengths and where they show up in the work, and really just understanding that the ways we communicate with people really do impact the relationships that we build moving forward, and those relationships will help drive our project in so many positive ways. And so what I'll leave you with, I'm so proud of myself. That was exactly 40 minutes. So some of these personal reflections that I'll leave you with before we can take some questions are, what are 3 things that you can commit to or that you can really obviously see right now that we can shift or do in our work to disrupt this status quo, to kind of throw a wrench into the way we used to do things? Maybe that's taking times off your agenda. And that is so small, but people might freak out, just so you know, but you can say that I told you to do it, don't worry. They can email me, noelle@lenprconsulting.com. And the second question is, what does equity look like in your sphere of influence? And so that is your workplace, that's also your friendships, your family. I love getting the question of, how do I talk to my racist uncle about this? It's hard, but those are the spaces and when we get to use our privilege to show up and promote equity in those spaces. So those are opportunities. And I really thank you for bearing with me on this 40-minute presentation, but I also really appreciate your reflections, because I know it is really tough to reflect on our own work and our own workplace, especially when things have always been done one way and we've been told they should be done one way. And so, yeah, those are my sort of learnings and some of the things I'd like to share, but I really appreciate the time, and we have time for questions, which is wonderful.
Noelle, Heichka, thank you so much. That was brilliant. And we have the question box is on fire, just so you know. So we have a lot of questions. And
Yay.
I also just want to invite participants to know that if you want to share your reflections, if you want to answer Noelle's reflection questions, we're going to bring up a QR code in about 10 or 12 minutes where you get to share what some of your key takeaways are from Noelle's amazing presentation on decolonizing project work. So we'll have those questions available to you, and I'll bring up a QR code momentarily. So at this time, we're just going to open up the floor. If you would like to pop a question in the Q&A function, I will moderate that for Noelle. If you are somebody that has, like myself, that struggles to get my fingers connected to the keyboard and my thoughts on the screen, I welcome you to just raise your hand, and I will invite you to unmute yourself too if you would like to bring your voice into today's conversation. 100 of you asked this question. Noelle, people really love your PowerPoint slide deck, and wondering if you would be able to share them, the PDF version of your presentation.
Yeah, of course.
Okay, awesome. So if it's okay with you, Noelle, we can make that available with all of our archived curriculum and content on our LPC website. Just look up the presentations tab at lenprconsulting.com. Many of you also asked if this is being recorded. Absolutely, and it will also be made available on our YouTube channel. So one question that came up was around gifting of elders. Are there any tips or tricks that you have for appropriate gifts to bring to community, or appropriate gifts to bring to leaders or elders that you're working with on projects?
Yeah, so in my experience, if you're asking something of someone, which you usually are when you're showing up, I usually bring an offering of ceremonial tobacco for the first question or the first sort of introduction to myself, so that it shows that I am trying my best to operate in a good way. However, also when you're working with an individual and they were to come, let's say, to my meeting and open and welcome us to their territory, I would, along with the honorarium, buy them a gift. I mean, it depends, but I like to sit it somewhere like $50 to $100-ish for a gift. That's kind of like where I sit usually. And for me, it's something like that will fit like a blanket from an Indigenous store, which is, some sort of really beautiful blanket, piece of art, like little things you can order, like mugs with art on them. I also, if you know the elder and you know there's something they like, get them jam, or like, some sort of something that they would really enjoy. If you have access to like Indigenous canned salmon, like I have a whole bunch in my closet right now. And so what I will do sometimes now is just throw one of those in a gift as well. So there's things you can do to make them quite personal. Also, if you work, what I have also seen is when we work with an elder many times, they have everything from every gift shop ever. So I know they like the Canucks, so I went and got them a shirt. So there's just different things that you can do to make it special for that person. But if you don't know them, if you know their nation, you could get them art from their nation. There's lots that kind of can be done, but those are my sort of suggestions.
Yes, love those, especially for those elders that, are very active and they keep coming to the same thing, and they have a million mugs and a million, tobacco ties and those types of things. Gift cards go a really long way because that's something they can use. If they love McDonald's or Tim Hortons or Starbucks, the gas cards are really useful as well. A follow-up question to that, Noelle, is have you had any experience with gifting for virtual engagements if people are meeting via Zoom or Microsoft Teams? Is there a way strategizing around gifting people through virtually?
Yeah, I always gift. So if it's virtual, I will ask if it's okay if I have their home address to mail. If that is not comfortable, totally okay. We preface that as well. And what we could do is send a virtual, like Len said, a gift card to their email or something like that. But sometimes if they are elders, maybe the technology is not as quite as strong. And so that is totally fine as well. And oftentimes then you could either drive to their home or deliver it or meet them somewhere. Those are my suggestions. But I always do a gift, even if someone were to come present and, I would pay them, even if they had a payment, I would offer them a gift as well, just to acknowledge that time and that sort of more personal aspect to it, I guess.
Yes, love that. And the next question is coming from Stella, and thank you, Stella, for this question. This is a question I often get as well, so I'll pose it to Noelle. Do you have any suggestions to replace the term stakeholders? I
Oh,
struggled to find one, but have used rights holders or those with vested interest. But I think it would require a culture shift for readers to understand what is being conveyed.
totally. Thank you for the question. Yeah, that one we've started to phase out. And so if we're not clear, the word stakeholder had been previously used to acknowledge people who had, like they said in the question, a vested interest in this project. And so that would involve any people you had to reach out to or clarify things with or consult in the project development. And so that word, when we break it down, stakeholder, means the person who holds the stake. And so in this scenario, it does relate to reserve land. And so plotting out the reserve land. So in this scenario, a stakeholder is actually a colonial entity, a settler, a colonizer who is determining where or when Indigenous people get to live. And so I think it's not super applicable to the work anymore, obviously, but also it is all those negative connotations and history. So I like partner, but sometimes partner has different meanings to different people. So you'll have to sort of vet that language between all the people you work with. But sometimes, if you want to have like a really concise word, you could say like, it's not coming to me actually. I thought it would, sorry. I think, like you said, it's people who should be consulted, right? Like these are individuals who should be consulted due to the impact that the project will have on them.
Mhm.
And so impact assessment, people to consult with, partners. I think, Len, have you heard sort of other language people like?
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. I think rights holders is a new one that I've heard recently on my travels. But I think it's also just really discerning the context in which you're trying to use the term stakeholders anyway. Like, so for so many people, it's just the nations, the land-based nations, right? Honoring them, just saying they are the nations. So not your partners, the stakeholders, they are the nations, and it's our
Yeah.
duty to work and engage with the nations. So even that one. But I think it's a great evolving conversation. I think it's picking the word that's most fitting to the context in which you mean to honor that relationship, getting back to that value of relationship.
Yeah, totally.
I see Gabrielle has their hand up, so I'm just going to allow you to talk. 1 second here. Here you go.
Gabrielle.
There you go, Gabrielle.
Hey, Len. Hey, Noelle. My name is Gabrielle. I actually work with Noelle at BC Emergency Health Services. And I was recently working as a project manager in clinical implementation, so working a lot with our internal partners. I'm going to use the word partners here. So my question was really related to the previous one that was asked, but I was wondering in terms of the standard project management terminology, there's certain things like stakeholder, also like buy-in and terms of reference, which we've kind of now set as intentions agreements. But I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit to how language influences project management, and so just some general practices to decolonize some of our processes and like standard day-to-day work based on language that we're choosing to use with the people we're working with.
Thank you, Gabrielle. Beautiful. I learned so much from Gabrielle, just so everyone is aware. And Language is huge. Language is super important. And I think that we will just continue to see shifts, in my opinion, even throughout my past 4 years of working in Indigenous health. I've seen shifts in language. We used to say a lot of Aboriginal, and now we use Indigenous. And so for me, it's the importance of being able to be flexible for when language shifts and understanding that Indigenous people, other folks, might come to me and say that's actually outdated language now. And it is my responsibility to then go, oh, okay, I have learned, I know better, and I will implement it. Because sometimes it is hard when language shifts. I know for, my parents, it can be difficult to keep up at times, but it is also their responsibility to be able to understand that when language shifts, we also shift. Len, do you want to speak to a little bit more about sort of language shifting?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things we always say in our cultural safety education and training sessions is that language is one of the greatest cultural safety tools you can ever mobilize in your professional practice, personally for yourself, as a team, and definitely as an organization. And we say that because cultural safety will always come down to these two simple, not easy things: training yourself to constantly examine and re-examine your own language and your behavior, your language and your behavior. And you've seen that interwoven through Noelle's entire presentation. Is we're always changing and challenging our current language and behavior. So language is going to be ever shifting and ever evolving because, we get set in a certain definition or way of using that word, and then we get upset when it changes again. Well, if we're getting upset about language shifting under our feet, well, then we're making it all about ourselves. We're no longer work-centered and we're no longer people-centered. If we're getting upset, we're being self-centered. So I think we need to have a great deal of patience on word choice and finding the right word. Ultimately, your best promising practice will be letting the people who you're working with choose the words how they like to be identified. Kind of like gender pronouns, right? My gender pronouns are he, him. But if people were calling me, she, or her, well, I'm gonna correct you. I'm gonna say no. I prefer to be identified as he and him. So I think that leaving some room for error is okay. If you're corrected, it's okay. This is not perfection. This is progress and practice. So I think that we always need a little bit of wiggle room and patience in the language that we choose. But language is no small thing because it constructs our thoughts, and our thoughts inform how we believe and will interact with other people. Noelle, if you want to stop sharing your screen, I'll bring up the QR code, and then I'll get to the next question. Oh my God, there's like 54 questions in the Q&A. I'll try and get through some more. People are really interested in the language choice. Some people are talking about interested parties, or parties. Again, I think it's just, what makes the most sense, and
Yeah, I think it's context a lot of the time.
context, totally.
And do we need a word for it? Maybe.
Yes. Well, yeah, exactly. Right. Okay. Some of these have already been answered, so.
So everyone, look at my really cute earrings that I got from Melody Markle, Melody Quay on Instagram. They're little birds, and they've been whispering all the right answers to me all presentation.
Some people are coming back to the conversation around equity and how some Indigenous communities and leaders are really about equity is different than reconciliation, cultural safety, decolonization. And another follow-up question is around equity and how that contributes to two white seeing. Do you have any thoughts there?
I would say the conversation about equity is interesting because it relates to most groups that have been marginalized by our systems. And so this isn't just Indigenous people. This is many different types of people who the system doesn't work for. And so DEI in many organizations is what it's called, diversity, equity, and inclusion, is often a program in and of itself within organizations. And DEI frameworks are very specific, and they have been within organizations for many, many years. And so when we talk about equity in a way, in the context of Indigenous health, equity is, I'd say, hardwired into every aspect of Indigenous health or Indigenous cultural safety, I guess, Indigenous programs. But for me, it's the difference between a DEI strategy within an organization has to have its own resources and its own stream of attention, I would say, as Indigenous cultural safety within whatever sector we are. Because what we have found and what we've seen is over the many years of DEI, it has worked incredibly for some folks, but not for Indigenous peoples. And so to look at equity in the context of diversity and inclusion is super important, but it's also important to look at it in the context of Indigenous people in this country. And so I think there's lots of overlap. They support each other in so many ways. They also sort of deserve and require their own focus and funding. So that's my sort of answer to that, but I know I didn't answer the whole thing.
That's great, a really great answer. I think maybe time enough for one or two more questions. How can you balance or decide when to consult or involve Indigenous teams when beginning a project? We want to ensure we aren't burdening them with work, document reviews, while also ensuring their voice, perspectives, and input is well integrated earlier on in the project. This is a really good question because this contributes to what I know Noelle and I both know equally is, working within the burden of representation, where you're asking your Indigenous team, the Indigenous community, to review everything that you're doing on a project.
Yeah. So there's a few ways, in my opinion, of thinking about that and approaching it. So my idea is always to go with a very open mind and a bunch of possibilities of what the involvement could be and what it could look like. So your job as the as the person working on the project is to make everything super clear to the partner, to the nation, to whoever you're working with, so that they can decide for themselves how much capacity they have and how much they're willing to give, or how much they can give at that time or on the project timeline. So I would go in and say, hey, this is what we're thinking of doing. First off, what do you think? Second off, how involved do you want to be? You could be this involved, this involved, this involved, or this involved, from highest to least. And then they might go, I actually don't need to be super involved. Come to me in 6 months with an update and I'll see how you're doing then. And you go, awesome. In 6 months, you come back. Or they say, we actually have capacity and we'd like to meet every 2 weeks. So we're super involved in the creation until a year. And then we can meet every 6 months. So I come with options so that people feel that we are open to whatever, acknowledging that we are open to as much engagement or as little engagement as they feel they're able to give. You can also sprinkle in there, could you give more engagement if there was money or less money or more money involved, or would there be timing that would work better for you if I gave you a presentation on the document and you could tell me what you thought, or would it be better to review it on your own time? Options. And so a lot of the times, I know specifically from Métis chartered communities, all of the leadership is volunteer. And so if you're asking for people's time, you will need to pay them or else they physically can't join you. And so there's those sort of considerations to be taken, but it is a tough line. It's a super tough line to walk, but I show up with the transparency of I am open to whatever you are open to, and I'll try my best to make it work with whatever you're asking. That's sort of my approach.
Yes, love that. I also love your strategy around cross-training other members of your team and your department, so you're not the only person, and the Indigenous team or department is not the only people with this knowledge on how to do this work in a less colonial, decolonized, equitable way. One of the tips that I offer teams is please do not go straight to the Indigenous department. Ask 3 non-Indigenous members on your team first. You do not know if they have the answer or not, or the promising practice, or the culturally safer strategy. So ask 3 people on your team, not anticipating they may have the answer, but at least try to alleviate that burden off of Indigenous voices. I am so sorry. That is all the time we have for questions. I think there's like 60 questions that we weren't able to get to. A lot of them were addressed, and I just couldn't keep up with reading them. Many questions on appropriate territory acknowledgements. Please do check out our territory acknowledgement resource.
Lots of good resources on the website.
Yes, absolutely. And again, feedback is our friend. Noelle has requested that you take a brief moment of time to scan this QR code. It goes into an anonymous report that compiles all of your feedback for this session. Again, this this is recorded and will be made available on our YouTube channel tonight. And please do share the resources that Noelle has provided to each and every one of you. Thank you all so much for taking time out of your busy schedules to be here. Noelle, my friend, my colleague, thank you so much for leaning in with your knowledge and your wisdom and expertise in this regard. I cannot thank you enough. Thank you, everybody. We'll see you at our next LPC webinar. Thank you all. Have a good day.
Bye.